I got into open source software because I was like, whoa, this is software that people are putting out for free that I can use for free, that's legal to use for free. I was like, what a great replacement for this terrible pirate culture. Just calling it server state or client state instead of global state, for some reason clicked for everyone. TanStack Start gives you a couple of things that you don't get with Router. You already have loaders and, lifecycle events and things with Router. But the problem is everything happens client-side. So what TanStack Start does is gives you server-side control and server-side utilities. Now, there really isn't anything you can't do with TanStack Router and Start that we would be missing from something like Next.js or Remix or React Router 7.
Are you a client-side hero that React needs right now?
No, that's all I want to do is I have applications that just don't need to have this server-first mentality.
React Universe on Air, your go-to podcast for all things cross-platform.
Hey everyone, and welcome to React Universe on Air. Today I'm really excited to have Tanner Linsley with me from TanStack, obviously. Me and Tanner, we met on React Summit New York a couple of months ago. And Tanner, you had a talk about TanStack Start framework. Do you remember that?
Vaguely.
Okay.
Vaguely.
So since then, you had a bunch of other talks and podcasts explaining TanStack Start and like its role in the community. So I would love to talk about that definitely. But really, there has been so much material about this. I want to take a different approach here and maybe discuss the TanStack ecosystem, because I can see that you have a bunch of libraries and you have a bunch of stories to tell. So maybe let's start there. Can you please introduce yourself and let us know how you got into programming in the first place?
So my name's Tanner Linsley. Let's see how I got into programming. In high school, I took a web class that was, HTML and very, very fresh off the press, new CSS stuff, it was all the rage, right? So CSS was getting hot. JavaScript was still very young. And I liked that class, but I didn't think anything of that class when I took it. I was just like, oh, this is neat. I seemed to be good at it, but I didn't think this is going to be my career. So I actually went on to study film and audio engineering for quite a while, because I had it in my head that I was going to be a film editor, producer. I was going to work for, I wanted to work for pro athlete videography companies like Red Bull and stuff like that. And, go snowboarding and film and that kind of thing. That ended up not being as glamorous as I thought it was going to be. And I eventually got into audio engineering because who doesn't love music? I was also very musical. I played many instruments growing up. I even wrote some songs, some music that's all terrible, but it was super fun. And ended up going to school for another 3 years for audio engineering. And while I was doing that, I started running out of money for school. I was working for an Apple retailer doing like Genius Bar work, and it just wasn't enough. So on the side, I started building websites.
What year was that?
Let's see, that was 2011, early 2012 that I started getting into that. I needed more money, so I was building websites on the side to make more money.
So no React yet, definitely. So probably some jQuery there.
Oh yeah, loads of jQuery. I was still going to school. I remember, it's actually funny. I think at the time, a lot of like the people that I looked up to in like the JavaScript ecosystem were working at Instructure and building Instructure, which is like this educational platform. And I remember thinking, they're building this platform, I probably with a framework, and here I am in class using jQuery to like try and automate it and make my work go faster at school. And like kind of it's not hacking, but just dinking around in the console with jQuery on this educational platform. So that's kind of where I started getting into JavaScript. I did a lot of WordPress. So I actually got a job doing full-time WordPress. And then over the course of about 2 years, the VP of tech left that company and I was promoted to VP of tech, which was scary. That's when I decided that I didn't want to dive too much deeper into PHP. Like I had gotten my hands dirty and with tons of PHP and MySQL and WordPress plugins and WooCommerce. I just didn't want to do that anymore. I wanted to build apps, like either web apps or native apps. So my first foray into like JavaScript for real was probably Ionic.
Ooh,
and
okay.
Angular.
I wasn't expecting to find any like cross-platform mobile technologies in your resume.
Yeah. So I actually learned Ionic and Angular like before I learned JavaScript for real. I mean, I knew PHP and I dabbled in some other programming languages before. So picking up JavaScript was not super difficult. But JavaScript frameworks and the JavaScript ecosystem are very different. So it took a little bit. But I wanted to build an application for like iOS.
If I can like jump in and ask you about that early experiences with software development with lots of different tools and ideas, do you feel that experience from 15 years ago or something helped you build all of those nice tools in like 2019, 2020, 2022 or something?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Like even when I was doing WordPress, I was getting really into open source software. So actually, here's some more backstory. I used to be like a pirate. I loved downloading movies, music, and all sorts of stuff. And I mean, this is a long time ago. I was naive and young, and I was still like, I could convince myself that it was okay to do that. But after, I mean, when I grew up, and I realized, hey, this is wrong. Like I shouldn't be doing this. I had to like stop doing that cold turkey. And so all this software and all this stuff that I was getting for free, like basically illegally when I was like 16 years old, I deleted all of that stuff from my youth and just, decided to true up. And part of that was I got into open source software because I was like, whoa, this is software that people are putting out for free that I can use for free. That's legal to use for free. I was like, what a great replacement for this terrible pirate culture. It sounds so terrible to say that on air. Actually, people are gonna be like, Tanner's like an evil dude.
I'm gonna use that in our episode like trailer or something.
Yeah.
Definitely.
Yeah, I mean, it wasn't difficult to stop doing that. And I think I stopped pirating stuff when I was like 17 years old. So it was a long time ago. But that drive for free software was still there,
I also feel like nowadays we take for granted how much free software we actually have right now, and we don't have to pirate, we don't have to buy. We get it for free. Like even the professional software for like photo editing and video editing and like OBS for streaming, we get all of that from open source for free. We don't have to pay for that. It wasn't like that 15 years ago.
No way. And it was very like, at the best case scenario, it was like very freemium shareware type stuff where, you'd get to use like this much of it and then you'd get roped into upgrading or paying some crazy amount. It's so much easier today to do stuff, especially with open source. So that's probably one of the really core Freudian reasons that I like got obsessed with open source in the beginning.
Well, researching you before this episode, before this recording, I've noted somewhere that you worked on Chart.js, and that was like a turning point for you when you like fell in love with open source. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, I actually had forgotten about that a little bit. So,
you're welcome.
Yeah. So I started a company with some friends shortly after that in like 2013. It's called Nozzle, Nozzle.io. It's still going today. It's awesome. This SEO marketing analytical platform. Very powerful, very cool. And when we started building that, we needed charting, lots of charts and dashboards. So I started looking around, and the best library I found was Chart.js, which at the time was 1.0. It wasn't fresh, but it had been out for a little while. And Nick, I can't remember his last name, but his GitHub handle is like NNNICK. Nick had built Chart.js, and then I think he got burned out and just totally left open source for a long time. Maybe he still has gone. I'm not sure. So I was using Chart.js at Nozzle, and I loved it, but I was bumping up against limitations, performance concerns, animation, like lack of animation for things. We needed to do just more. And I was like, hey, I think I could, hack some of this together. And so I remember getting on the GitHub issues, which was the best place that we had at the time to talk about anything. And I was like, hey, I'm willing to take this project over and take it to the next level, but I don't even know where this guy Nick is. And another guy I met, Everett Timberg, he was kind of looking to do the same thing even more. And Everett and I teamed up and found Nick somewhere, like through email or something like that. And we're like, hey, we want to take this to the next level. And he's like, sure. Here's published keys. Here's GitHub rights. Go for it.
Sorry, I just need to interrupt here. What a crazy story when you have the library Chart.js and you think, oh, I can hack around it. I can maybe do some improvements. And then you go, okay, so I want to take over this library.
I mean, we didn't want to take it over. We wanted Nick to do it. We wanted Nick to upgrade all this stuff. And he basically was like, no, I don't have time. I don't want to do it. If you guys want to do it, let me know. And we were like, whoa, okay. And me and Everett hadn't really done anything like that before. So we teamed up and just started building Chart.js 2.0. I can't remember exactly what we built because it's been a long time, but I know we rebuilt the animation, like all of the animation framework inside of it. We redid a bunch of the layering for like all the different canvas layerings. We did a lot of stuff. And it was, when we launched 2.0, it was a big deal. It kind of paved the way for Chart.js to explode even more.
I think even in that first big open source experience that you have, and it's going to come up in the future work as well, I think what stands out to me is that you have a project that needs that functionality. So you build that functionality in the open source, and that's like a feedback loop that you get, that you can try it out on your own project that's quite big already. But also you get those like use cases. You get the use cases for the library. You get the new ideas and new stuff that you want to implement there because your product needs that functionality. I think that's pretty important when you start working in open source. You don't build just for the sake of building it. You build it because you have a need for it.
Yeah, there's a big need for it. And also it's like, if I'm going to build it anyway, it would be really cool if I could build it in a way that just works for 90% of the other, everybody else using it as well. So yeah, I think that's a really important feedback loop because it's fun. It's fun to do that. And that's one of the reasons that it's kind of like owning a business and having customers without having to go through all of the hassle of owning a real business and having real customers. You get to build a product, ship it to users, get fast feedback, and you get that kind of rush fulfilling a need for people and making it better over time, over and over.
So after that Chart.js first introduction to open source, I think what happened there, because I read a bunch about you and about your companies, is that at Nozzle, you had a need for React query. What was the use case that you were trying to solve at Nozzle at that time? Not as the very high-minded idea behind the React query, but like the simplest use case that you encountered one day and said, okay, I think this library might be helpful in solving that.
Believe it or not, query was not the first one that I needed at Nozzle.
Okay, what was that?
It was actually React table.
Okay, yeah.
So the table scene was very similar to the chart scene. There were a couple of libraries that were okay. AG Grid was there. It was very new though, and it was only for Angular. And we had already moved to React. We were using a tool called NG Grid in Angular, and then we moved to React, and there was nothing there. AG Grid had started to work on their, React support, but it was still young. It wasn't ready. I just needed something that worked at all. So I just threw together this table component like overnight and started using it internally in Nozzle. And it was it was a component, and it was built 100% with React. It was just like a bunch of class components thrown together into basically React table. And that was a big undertaking because tables are crazy. Data grids are nuts. You can do so many different things with them, go so many different directions. That project got really popular. The minute that I open sourced it, it got really popular and kind of exploded for a data grid, right? And that was kind of the first one that I was like, if I'm going to build this for Nozzle and I used it and I loved it, then why wouldn't I just give it away for free? Because it's front end, it's JavaScript, it's client side code. I'm like, there's not a lot of like intellectual property protection needed for something like that. People are going to use it. Developers are going to find it. They're going to reverse engineer it. And if my solution isn't the open source one, there will be one there anyway. Yeah, it was really successful. And that was kind of my first library that took off. After that, I thought, well, I really like this library thing. And I saw, I had been, this was in the era of like Hugo was really big, which is a static site generator. Kyle Matthews was building Gatsby. Next.js was a static, like doing static site generation stuff. I was really into that, and we needed to build our marketing site for Nozzle. And I was like, hey, what if we just use, I'm the only front-end developer for our company, our startup at the time. So I was like, well, if I have to build this marketing site, it'd be really cool if I could just use React and use all the components that I built for the app for the marketing site too. So let's do that. And I couldn't find a good solution for that either. And so I built a library called React Static, which for all intents and purposes was like, it was the first framework that I ever built, like the first front end framework. And it was a massive undertaking because frameworks are just really, really difficult to do.
We don't have many guests on this podcast that can say in the conversation, that was my first framework that I ever built.
It was React Static. It was a little bit ahead of its time, just almost like Gatsby was ahead of its time a little bit, and Next.js. Like these frameworks, we were struggling to like make sense of these new ideas we had, but still using kind of these like, the best tools we had at the time. So you got to remember that we didn't have hooks yet. We didn't have React hooks. We didn't have a lot of great tools. It was all still like CSS and JS was exploding and everybody was obsessed with that. So at the end of the day, React Static got pretty popular too. Like when we launched it, it was pretty cool. And honestly, if I had stuck with it, React Static would have turned into something really, really big. At the time, when we were doing it actively, we were the fastest static site generator for React on the market. We were beating out Gatsby compile times, Next.js compile times. I'm glad that I didn't go down that route because just like Gatsby, I would have needed to basically turn it into my full-time job, create a cloud platform, or eventually get into like server-side rendering.
Yeah, probably. I was thinking in terms of there are no meaningful right now static site generators that do just static. If you wanted to turn that into like a proper framework, you'd have to go to the route of Next.js, which is like make it all. You can do client side, server side components, what else, static, all of that, and mix all of those together.
I think one of the missing pieces at the time was this was still before serverless had really taken off, and not just serverless in general, but servers being more accessible for front-end technology for JavaScript, that hadn't really taken off yet. It was still in the early stages of that. And so when we were thinking of static sites, everything needs to start with a server. And the best server we had was on our machines at build time. We had CI. We could do stuff in CI, but we just weren't thinking big enough, and the technology around serverless stuff hadn't caught up yet, or just running JavaScript easily on the server in general. As that started to catch up, well, before that happened, I got out of React Static. I needed to focus on Nozzle. So I gave React Static away to some people who were going to maintain it and continue working on it. And I went back to Nozzle because we were, expanding, we were growing, I just needed to focus my efforts there. So that is about around the time when React Query started to take shape inside of Nozzle.
So going back to my initial question about React Query, probably you haven't started it with this like high-level philosophical thinking about server state and client state and synchronizing. You had a real problem on your hands. What was that problem that you were trying to solve?
The problem at the time was that we had all this data that we were fetching from the server, from our API. Tons of it. We had workspace data, user data, teams, projects, keywords, groupings, and like all the columns. Everything that we needed to make Nozzle work was coming from this API, and it was a ton, and it was like, we had the schemas, and we even investigated using something like GraphQL to like bring all that back down, and some of that led into like, well, maybe we should adopt Apollo. And GraphQL, when we gave it a proof of concept, GraphQL was not the right tool. Like, we were a very small team. It just put a lot of layers of indirection between us and just getting things done. So what it really boiled down to was I needed a way to just basically synchronize all of this data down into our application and keep it up to date. Like, for lack of a better term, it's a sync engine that you kind of build yourself. And that's what I needed. At the time, I was using Redux for that. So I had Redux stores and substores everywhere. A substore for I think they call them slices. There was a slice for every single concern of the API. And inside of there, I always found myself repeating over and over the same actions that was like refresh, synchronize, and then the words started changing to just sync, like sync. Just give me all of the new stuff. And I would have to fire those actions off manually all the time. And it got to the point where it wasn't up to date enough for the user to be like, where are my changes? Am I seeing the latest stuff? And then we had users start working on the same things at the same time. Not real-time collaboration, but working in the same, workspace or team. And there wasn't really a great way at the time for us to like channel that back down to the application without going really deep into WebSockets. So I had this idea even before, like just when we were using Redux, I was like, you know what? Every single time the user focuses the page, or every single time that they navigate a page, I'm just going to resync everything. And that was really heavy and slow with what we had with Redux. And it was very manual. Like, I ended up building my own custom hooks. So React hooks came out, and I built these hooks that's like, anytime you wanted to use data out of Redux, you had to use my hook to get it, so that I could get in the middle and say, oh, you're subscribing to users? Well, I'm going to make sure that anytime we navigate, we're refetching users. So that's kind of where it started. And from there, it just started to snowball.
Sorry to jump in, but like, it's so fascinating to me when I hear you speak about this, is how you're using the tool Redux and you basically implement your own system within Redux. You implement your own, yeah. I don't know how to say. Yeah, you hack around it so that it does what you need it to do.
Yeah. Well, and not just hack around it, but essentially I put my own API in front of Redux.
Yeah.
And I started powering my own ideas with Redux. until it got to the point where I was like, what would be really cool is if I could kind of break the rules of Redux a little bit and have this global store follow me around and just be able to kind of like store state there and mutate it and store timers in it. Stuff that like Redux stores are supposed to be serializable and immutable. And, it no longer felt Redux. And the
Redux was just a glue for you to
it was
like
just an implementation
store it somewhere. Yeah.
Yeah. It just a detail. And the minute that I started to rip Redux out and build what is today is the query client or like the query cache class instance, that's really where React Query was kind of like born, right? As I was like, oh my goodness, I'm writing my own Redux. And then I sat there for a minute and I was like, wait, I'm writing my own state management software that's specifically designed for this task that I've been having a hard time with. And at the time I was like, wow, there's other libraries that are trying to do this and they have some good ideas, but they haven't nailed all of them. If anybody remembers, this library didn't take off too much, but there was a library called Dracula.
No, I don't remember that.
So it was like Dracula, but QL at the end, right? And they were supposed to be geared towards like GraphQL, but they had nailed some of these APIs like use query and use mutation. And I liked that about the GraphQL ecosystem, the query, the mutation talk, and kind of the life cycle around that. So I took inspiration from Dracula or GraphQL, and that's where the first version of the API took place, is use query, use mutation. But instead of being GraphQL, I just said, you know what, let's support anything that's a promise and we'll call it a day. And that's basically where it was born.
Thanks for that GraphQL mention, because like when I first, so for your earlier open source work, the Chart.js, React Static, and React Table, those were not like very original concepts, right? Like the charts, the tables, you just build what you need. The React query, when I first saw it and how it's perceived in the ecosystem as well, is that this is something completely new. This is an original thought that and like I didn't know this Dracula, but I thought this is an original thought. This is something new. This is a new paradigm. It's not just the state management. This is something original. So what was the work on it like? What was the community reaction like? How your life changed after that?
I had known from talking with other people who built clients like Apollo and Dracula, and Urkel came out a little bit after that. And then also like when I launched, actually, SWR from Next.js launched like literally days after that. We didn't even know we'd been working on the same thing. So there was obviously something going on in the ecosystem driving everyone to want to kind of build this solution. But what I found is that when I launched it and started marketing it to developers that, hey, this is going to solve your problems, a lot of them didn't even know they had this problem because it was being solved partially by tools that were great, like Redux. Redux is and was a great tool that was partially solving this problem. And so it's difficult to convince people to replace a tool that is great, that is only partially solving a problem with a different tool. It took a lot of education to do that, which is where, and I don't know if I would maybe call this a skill that I have to some degree, but finding a way to educate developers that feels innovative, but isn't really something that's new that they have to learn. Just calling it server state or client state instead of global state, for some reason, clicked for everyone. And they were like, whoa, you're right. I've been thinking about global state for the last 4 years. And it's like you allow them to think differently, say, no, it's client state and server state. And they're like, huh. And all of a sudden everything made sense. And that's kind of the platform that I got on. As soon as I adopted that marketing for the library, everybody seemed to get it. And that's when I started giving talks and doing podcasts about it. And yeah, it was honestly really surprising to see how quickly it went from what I don't understand what this library does. What is a query? What is a mutation? To now all of a sudden there's people who are preaching to other people going, no, that's client state. That's server state, and I'm like, oh no, what have I done?
No, but I remember even in the projects that I worked on when we started looking into those kinds of solutions, there were a bunch of different already talks and, like you say, preachers of this, like client state, server state, like we should be using that. And funny that you mentioned Redux, that was already solving some of that problems, because then RTK query came into Redux itself, which is a very like mirror solution to React query.
Yeah, and I think that's really smart. Mark's the one who did. Mark Erickson is the one who did almost all the work on, not all of it, but a lot of the work on like RTK, which is like this new, fresh generation of Redux, like Redux toolkit. And I think the idea of trying to bring that same primitive into Redux is really good, because there's companies that are entrenched in technology everywhere that they can't change, right? So giving them upgrade paths to these concepts and these utilities without making them totally switch is definitely useful. I think the interesting part, though, is that what I saw in practice is that most front-end developers were only using Redux for this, and maybe a little bit of true global state that should have just been either in memory or in the URL. But other than that, which kind of leads me to the next portion of my journey, but I saw that when they replaced React Query, like when they started using React Query, there was no more global state that they needed to manage, because their global state was just a cache of their server state. So I think that was a big realization for a lot of people, that it's like, oh, wow. And you're already seeing that today again, where for the people that didn't move on to React Query or did, and they're still wanting more, what you're seeing now is a revitalization of sync engines, right? And React Query is, like TanStack Query is a sync engine. It's just a different, unique flavor of sync engine that you kind of put together on your own. It's schemaless. But you're seeing it happen again. There's people that are like, oh, look at this cool thing. It can solve all of our sync engine problems. So we're just always rediscovering, things from the past that can be applied or marketed in a different way to be like, oh, yeah, that does solve my problem. I should use that. So we're going to see the same thing happen with sync engines already are over the next couple of years.
I think the next step that you referred to is router, right? But before we go to router, I want to maybe touch on a little bit about the framework-agnostic approach, because React Query was React Query at the beginning, and then the decision was made by you, probably, but let me know if I'm wrong, to make it server agnostic and to name it TanStack Query. So can you talk about that for a little bit?
The decision was basically made by the people using it who wanted it in other places.
Okay.
There was a large group of people who were using React. They were like, hey, but Vue is really cool too. We'd love to use tools there. And I was like, yeah, that would be really cool. But right now it's just React. Already I had seen an issue in React's table with, relying too much on React, especially as React was changing slowly over the years. I didn't want to be necessarily locked into the React ecosystem, because I believed what I had built was useful for more than just React. So there was like there's a big break in the middle of like query and kind of the next generation of the libraries that we built, where we just spent a really long time going through both framework-agnostic efforts and also TypeScript efforts. In fact, they were kind of done at the same time, because they were really, really big refactors to go to an agnostic code base. And if you know anything about refactors, if you don't have types, refactors are really, really scary. it was slow going at first because I had to learn TypeScript, not just learn how to use TypeScript, but use like library level TypeScript and generics while I was refactoring React Table into TanStack Table, while we were discussing how we were going to do the same thing for query. And I had, by that point, I had help. So Dominic Dorfmeister, aka TK Dodo, and a handful of other people were currently helping me with React Query at the time. And so we kind of did all this at the same time. We said we're going to make framework agnostic cores and strip all of the logic that doesn't have to do with React into these cores. And we did it with table, we did it with query, and then we built adapters around them to kind of translate the state management. That came with a lot of new challenges. In fact, even though we didn't release it for another 2 or 3 years, that's where TanStack Store was born, was this requirement to have some kind of a store state management solution that we could use internally in our core and translate back out to all the different types of reactivity and state management that's, for each framework.
For the framework question, maybe you can answer which one of those is the most difficult to work with? Which gave you the most headaches?
Vue is not bad. They work with observables, and it's not too difficult to take events coming out of out of an immutable store and translate them into observables. And same thing with Solid. It wasn't very difficult to do it with Solid either. Angular was a little more difficult, but I wouldn't say because of that problem. Angular is just it feels very proprietary compared to kind of the modern day framework. And there's a lot of NGRX stuff. So Angular was a little bit more challenging. Svelte, I think, is one of the more challenging ones. And even today, Svelte 5, I think, is making it easier. But I'll be honest, I'm not involved much with the Svelte efforts. It's a relatively small subset of users and people who want the Svelte adapters. So we're kind of letting the Svelte community step up and work on those adapters if they want to. But I think that's the general order of things. What's cool is that when we went by going headless and core agnostic, we basically got Preact and React Native for free.
Yeah.
Because if you're headless, then it doesn't really matter what you're using for UI. And if it works, if we have a React adapter, we can build a Preact adapter.
This leads me to my next question. You mentioned Headless here, and I have in my notes that in your documentation, in your libraries, you often emphasize those being headless, type safe, zero dependencies. So why are those principles so important for you when you build the ecosystem, when you build the libraries?
I think there's two sides to it. One side is my sanity, and the other side is it's just really useful. So let's start with my sanity. So I actually have a talk that I gave at React Summit in Amsterdam about React Table. You should go watch it. It's about building React Table and why these things were important about headless and type safety. But generally, by going headless, you're removing an entire swath of problems and use cases that people are going to want to customize about an experience. And if you go headless, you open that gate and just say, you can do whatever you want. After you get the logic, you can do whatever you want with your markup. You can do whatever you want with your styles. You can switch things around. All we do is handle the logical part of it. And I think that embraces a lot of like the Unix style componentization approach, where instead of trying to be this tool that is trying to cross many gaps, trying to cross many concerns, we're just going to do one thing and we're going to do it really well. And if we need to do the other thing too, then we're going to make it a separate thing and do it really well. A great example of that is we took React Table headless. So it handles all of the logic for you for building a data grid. We didn't really specialize in the UI part of it, the markup and the styles. Well, now you see ShadCN. ShadCN is this ultra successful UI approach. And he kind of did the same thing, but mirrored. He probably thought, I don't want to build all the logic around a data grid. I don't want to build all the logic around, these complex tables. So he just built the UI part of it. And because TanStack table is headless, they can just merge together flawlessly.
So meaning the prescription for success here is focus on some atomic part of it and make it really good. And then this is pluggable to other systems that are really good as well on the atomic parts of their part of the job. And then it just works. Because if you've built the React table, the logic part of it would be really good, but then the opinionated view part of it would suck for some people. Then it wouldn't be as popular.
Yeah. And that's how I learned is I did that. I built it all together. I built a component with markup and styles, and so much of the support requests and the complaints and just the entitlement around, open source was just focused on, I just want my table to look the way that I want it to look. I want to use my components. I want to use my styles, and they want to override everything. And you can't do that in a good way without basically exploding the complexity and the size of a library. So that's the biggest reason that I did it. TypeScript, this doesn't need to turn into a TypeScript podcast, but all I can say is that if you're not using TypeScript, you either don't know the benefits that it will give you, or you do know and you're being stubborn about it because you either don't work with a team that's big enough to need it, you're not doing refactors that are big enough to lean on it, or you're not shipping code that's used by enough developers that they're going to find the holes in your code. There's even a couple of people that I'm thinking of personally right now that are just so stubborn that they will not use TypeScript. They see it as an overhead. They see it as a problem. That was me. 4 years ago, I was very anti-TypeScript. And, because, I'm one of those people where even for really large projects like React Table and React Query, I could keep almost all of it in my brain. And it's taxing. It was taxing, but I could do it. Like I had all of the types and the contracts and the API in my head. And, I just knew what I could do and what I couldn't. And yeah, we had some tests. I didn't even like to write tests, but it's like, I could handle it most of the time. And then the time came when I needed to refactor or bring somebody new onto the team, like TK Dodo, or just any big moment where we needed to change something. And Dominic was like, so what is the contract here? And you end up distilling all this information out of your squishy, terrible brain to someone else's squishy, terrible brain. And, not that we have terrible brains, but we're just not good at remembering all these details at scale. And eventually you'll forget. It will decay. It will bit flip. You'll forget a contract. TypeScript takes all of that away. You take all of that architecture and contract and signatures and types, and you make it explicit in your code. And if you do it right, you don't have to write a lot of TypeScript. You really don't. If you do complex stuff, you do, which is fine. By the time you get there, you'll probably enjoy it. Like I enjoy it. But when you do that, you liberate yourself from all of that cognitive overhead that you were keeping in your brain for JavaScript. And like I said, maybe that's not a problem for some people because they're not working on a project that's big enough or that's complex enough. And that's fine. But eventually you'll get there. I hope that people would eventually get to the point where they are building cool stuff that necessitates that. Today, I would not start a project without TypeScript. I think it would be foolish. In fact, even when I'm just playing around with something in Code Sandbox or whatever, I still do it in TypeScript because it's so easy to just misuse your own contracts and abuse the language of JavaScript. It is an easily abused language.
Going to the last principle that I found, zero dependencies.
Not having dependencies is a good idea, because usually if you want to deliver the best product you can, you'll eventually or gradually want to have more and more control over the entire experience. If you don't have control over like the pipeline of your product, then I hope that either if you do have a dependency, it's worth it because it's something you don't want to have to handle. Or instead of having a hard dependency on something, build your library in a way that can just integrate with it or integrate with any tool like that dependency. We're not 100% true on that with all of our libraries. Like TanStack Start wouldn't be anything without Vite, and wouldn't have been anything for the last, 1 year of beta without Vinci, and, won't be anything for the next 6 months to a year, maybe without. So dependencies are sometimes necessary, especially for things that you don't want to build yourself.
It's funny how you reminded me of TanStack Start, because that was my initial idea about this episode. So let's slowly move toward that new JavaScript framework that you built. But In order to get there, we have to talk about yet another TanStack library, which is TanStack Router. Question to you, connected with TanStack Router, do you think that client side was underappreciated and overlooked in React community over the past, 4 years or something like that?
Yeah, parts of it were. There's parts of it that were prioritized. Like the React team themselves have been working on the compiler, which is very much client-side oriented, So there's certain parts of the client experience that many of us are still thinking about. And there's parts that I think that we reached kind of a good enough level of satisfaction and we just kind of moved on. And that good enough probably means that things were good enough for most people to ship good products. So no more innovation, just stops and moves on to the next nail that's sticking out, and we say, well, how can we hammer this next nail? For me, the reason that I started getting into Router comes from Nozzle again. So at Nozzle, we were building dashboarding systems. And part of this experience was we just have a lot of different dashboards. And there's the concept of drill through, right? Where you're on one dashboard and you're looking at an item in a dashboard. And you're kind of like, I want to investigate that item a little bit more. And you click on it and you kind of dive in deeper to that segment of data. And it might be the same dashboard, but just kind of a deeper view, or it could be a different dashboard. Or it could even be that you're like, you know what? I want to edit my settings for that piece of data. Like I want to go to the admin part of it to kind of change some of my configuration. So there's a lot of navigating around in this very interactive data exploration vibe that we had from Nozzle. And as we got deeper and deeper into building more dashboards, I found that an area of friction for me was the URL, because we had users that work in big teams, marketing teams, SEO teams, and they're diving into this data and they see something that's like, oh my gosh, look at this chart. It just went down, what the heck happened here? And they either take a screenshot and they send it to somebody, and then they're like, well, I don't know, I can't go off of a screenshot. And they take the URL and they send it to their coworker, and their coworker's like, what am I looking at? Because everything looks fine. Because we weren't keeping enough of the state into the URL. And this was like 4 or 5 years ago, long time ago, in terms of like the life of React query and router. Like this is a long time ago, so it's been a problem for a while. And we started playing with how much state could we put in the URL. Could we just serialize all of our global state and put it into a share link? At the end of the day, it boiled down to the tools that were managing the URL. And that was React Router at the time. It was React Router v5. And when I started diving into this problem, they were working on React Router v6 and it was in beta. It was in beta for, I think, like 2 years or something like that. But it was good enough that I started building kind of like what I did with Redux. I said, I'm going to start building my solution to this problem on top of a great tool like React Router. And I did. I started proxying all of the React Router hooks and components through my own versions that would allow me to manage URL state better, to have better contracts, to better type safety. And that went on for about a year. And we used that internally at Nozzle for quite a while. But eventually I hit the glass ceiling. I needed more control than React Router could give me and more control than they were willing to give up. Because there were other people asking for, can you expose this context, this React context? Or, could we augment the API here or change some of the way the core mechanics work? I get it. They didn't want to do that. And so I didn't really have much choice at that time to just say, okay, then I need to now replace the, implementation detail, just like I did with Redux. I need to replace it with something of my own that is just going to have the right contracts that I need for Nozzle.
Meaning you've already built so much on top of React Router then that the internal library was basically your dependency, and you just swapped the dependency for something that you wrote your own.
And I was able to even get rid of some of the external stuff that I was wrapping it with by just making it first class. So by making search parameters a first class citizen of the navigational APIs, I got rid of all of my search parameter hooks. At the time, they were working on Remix, which had loaders and actions and a lot of cool stuff there. And I thought, well, while I'm at it, why don't I just add loaders to this library that I'm doing? Client side only loaders, but still loaders. And so it started to take shape, and it actually was called React Location in the beginning.
Yes. Yeah, I found that when I was preparing for this episode, I was trying to find the libraries that are no longer mentioned on TanStack site, and I came across this React Location library, and I was like, yeah, I found it. I can ask Tanner about this location library, and then I clicked on the link, and it redirected me to Router.
Yeah, that's on purpose. You can actually, there is a branch, I think, in TanStack Router that has the old React Location code in it, if you wanted to go look at it. But really what it is if you go look at the code, it was kind of my learning experience on, can I build a router? Which, if you ask anybody, a lot of people will say, well, yeah, sure, anybody can build a router. That seems really easy. It's deceptively simple and turns into a very complex task. So React Location was my playground to kind of say, can I do it? And how well can I do it? And at the time, intellectual property and protection of ideas had come up a lot between Remix and Next.js. And they were kind of, quibbling over that to some extent. It was kind of a sensitive topic. I really didn't want to get into that. So I challenged myself with React Location to build all of it just without looking at anything. Not just React Router source code, but any other routers, Wouter, just anything. I just wanted it to be fresh and maybe even come up with some of my own innovations around how to do it. Now that I've done that, I think a lot of it ends up being similar. There's some concepts you just can't get away from. But there are a lot of things internally that end up being very different in a good way.
So talk about that. Talk about the principles for React, for TanStack Router.
The principles for the router, I think they start with the URL. So the URL is just another place to store state. And if you think about it,
and very important one.
Very important state. It's actually, if you can imagine, we use local storage all the time. And if you take one key out of your local storage that can hold a string, now imagine taking that one local storage key's string and permanently placing it at the top of your application. That's the URL, right? It's a locally and shareable, stateless, stringified representation of where you are and what you're doing, with the added context of the browser history, which is where now you have a version, you now have versioned stacks of these stringified states. That is really the core of it. And you can almost start to think of the URL as like a versioned database, right? It's a database with one column, one row. Well, no, multiple rows, I guess, if you want to think about rows as like history, right? And you can update that one cell with new values that can represent the user's new state. It's the part, though, where users can just hit refresh or share that URL that breaks all of that down. So my biggest frustration after I got into this dashboard experience with Nozzle was then, I mean, even before that, was going to a website, you doing something, you click on some filters or you click somewhere, you hit refresh to refresh your page because something broke, obviously, and then you're lost. What you were doing is gone. You're back at the home screen, or who knows what else has just happened. That's a really frustrating experience for an end user. It's maddening for somebody who's working in an enterprise application. So the URL needs to represent where you are, what you're doing, and it needs to have everything in it, not only to recreate most of your local experience if they hit refresh, but it needs to have everything in it to replicate the necessary experience for someone else if you were to share that URL. That's what it all boils down to. And these principles are shared by most URLs. I mean, when React Router came out, one of their big things was, we support command click, where you can hold command and or control and click on a link, and it will open in a new tab and actually be where you want to be, because they were doing real path name tracking and path name generation, using the URL as a source of truth instead of like hash bang routing. So in a similar fashion, TanStack Router builds on that principle and says, you know what, we're not only going to worry about the path, we're going to worry about search parameters, your history. We're going to do things like route masking. And there's lots of features that build on top of that. And even some ones that get really into the weeds, like if you're going to use the URL as state management, how quickly can you update the URL? Turns out you can update it really quickly, but not in every browser. So like with Safari, if you try and update the URL too fast, too often, you'll get throttled. And the browser will be like, hey, this website's trying to do something weird with your URL. So I ended up building this like synchronization queuing system between the router and the URL to take updates that happen within the same micro tick and bash them into the URL so that you're not spamming it. So there were a lot of like really low level things to figure out with the URL, but that's one of the guiding principles there. And the other guiding principles are pretty much shared between the other libraries. It can't be totally headless because there are components that you need to render. But in the spirit of headless UI, we can take as much opinion out of the routing as possible so that we don't interfere with your markup and your styles and the UI code that you write. So mostly just keeping it logical. The other principle of, being agnostic is really great. So we ripped out the core of TanStack Router into a router core that is just TypeScript. So today, while we're talking, they're chatting on Discord right now. Brandon Roberts is working on an Angular router version of TanStack Router. We already have a solid router version of TanStack Router that you can use today that's ready to go. So all the same principles apply. The type safety this is one where it got really, really deep into type safety because no other router had really tackled type safety in the way that I wanted to. And it took, honestly, about a year or two to figure out even how to do that in a way that would be scalable.
Yeah, there is a migration guide between React Location and TanStack Router, talking about how the type safety is different between the two.
Yeah, which in a good way, the migration guide kind of says you don't have to pass anything because we just infer everything now. So you get to remove types from your code if you move to TanStack Start. In fact, I think it's one of the things that kind of speaks to the quality of the types and the thought process that we put into it, is that you can have an entire route with loaders and components and, server functions and all this cool stuff. And you likely will not see a single bit of TypeScript syntax in the entire file.
Nice.
It just looks like JavaScript.
Nice.
And that's kind of a testament to the level of care that we've put into it.
Going back to the beginning of this episode, when I said we've met after your talk about TanStack Start, and that I didn't want for this podcast to be about TanStack Start exclusively, it turns out that this podcast was almost exclusively about other things than TanStack Start. But, surprise, surprise, over the past 10 minutes, we've been actually talking about TanStack Start, because TanStack Router is an integral part, it's a most important part of TanStack Start. So can you talk about that, and also what are the other 10% of things that compose to TanStack Start?
TanStack Start, yeah. It is interesting that we're marketing it as a separate thing, as a wrapper around router, which it kind of is. But so what's really interesting is if you were to go and build a TanStack Router application, client-side application, use all the APIs, build everything you can with TanStack Router, the only change you would need to maybe make to go to Start would be you would likely want to adopt file-based routing instead of code-based routing. But other than that, there's no breaking changes that you would need to make to any of your routes or your routing to use TanStack Start, because TanStack Start is not a different router or a different library. It's just additional tools and context to use with router. So they're actually more parallel and side by side than they are wrapping one another. So TanStack Start gives you a couple of things that you don't get with router. You already have loaders and, lifecycle events and things with router. But the problem is everything happens client side. So what TanStack Start does is gives you server-side control and server-side utilities. The first thing it does is gives you server functions and API routes. So now in your loaders for your routes, instead of doing something on the client, you can shift that logic into a server function or an API route, and it will only run on the server. Even when we SSR, or when you get to the client and you're just using TanStack Router, we ensure that it will always go back to the server for you. So that's the first thing that you get. The next thing that TanStack Start does is it takes your single client-side entry and it splits it into two, so that now you have a client-side entry, but you also have a server-side entry, which gives you server-side rendering, handles all of the hydration for you, and allows you to have cool things like streaming. So you can now do streaming through, Suspense or whatever else you want to do. And then it produces a new integration layer for things like TanStack Query to work even smarter. One of the things we have an integration for TanStack Query that links up TanStack Router and TanStack Start together. And now you can just use suspense query in your component, and you don't have to do anything else. You don't have to dehydrate or use initial props. You don't have to use suspense or anything like that. You just use suspense query, and you get streaming to, SSR capable streaming just right out of the box. So it's a really impressive extension, I think, to the router that just lets you have full stack capabilities. And I'm not saying just a few full stack capabilities. There really isn't there really isn't anything you can't do with TanStack Router and Start that that we would be missing from something like Next.js or Remix or React Router 7. I think
that's actually my next question. Like, how do you position TanStack Start alongside those two, alongside Next.js and Remix?
So I guess I have to say RSC, React Server Components, is one area that we don't have everything yet. That's kind of the only area. And for that, I've heard you talk a lot about some really fun ideas how you can incorporate React Server Components in TanStack Start. Yeah. So let's talk about that next. I think it's worth hitting on. Maybe we can end on that. But positioning Start and Router in the ecosystem has been interesting because the router is very much a client-side router. It's a client-side framework. Start makes that a full stack framework, but it doesn't change the APIs of the router. So you're very much still writing a client-side oriented or, a client-side principles first application that happens to have full stack capabilities like everything else. So that is mostly the positioning that I've taken with it, because it isn't like Next.js where everything is server oriented and server first. And Remix kind of sits more in the middle, but even Remix, it still has a decent side of it that's very server first. We got to go back to the server to do things. Both Next.js and Remix can operate the way that TanStack Router does in a client first fashion. Remix more so than Next, but the APIs and like the conventions and the happy paths for those weren't designed to be a client-side first experience, in my opinion. Next.js, definitely not so.
Yeah, the default is just the server-side rendering.
And Remix is much, much better about it. They sit, I think, evenly in the middle. You can do this on the server, or you could do this in the client. But for apps that have already been written as client-side applications that want to just start taking part in an SSR experience or server functions or just some of those features on their own, they'll probably feel more at home in something like TanStack Router because everything is written from the client-side perspective where the server is 100% optional.
So Tanner, let me ask you this. Are you a client-side hero that React needs right now? Those people who already created a bunch of applications on client?
No, the real heroes are the people who are just going to keep building their apps as client-side apps. Those are the real heroes, because that's all I want to do. Is I have applications that just don't need to be, they don't need to have this server-first mentality, but that doesn't mean that I want to ditch the ability to SSR or ditch the ability to have server functions or API routes or anything like that. Like, I want to do all those things too, or have React Server Components. Like, you shouldn't have to choose, based on the style that you approach to build your application. You shouldn't have to give things up. And that kind of happened when Next.js kind of pivoted and said, we're just going to be server first. And, Remix focused for a really long time on the server as a server first library. And now they're kind of reconciling. So I don't know. I just think that there's a lot of applications out there that are going to stay the way they are as client-side applications. And they shouldn't be left in the dust in terms of what they're able to do, simply because, they say, oh, we're just going to move to Vite and we're going to keep using a client-side router. There's two great options there. You use React Router. That's probably what they're using already. Or you can use TanStack Router and actually upgrade your client-side routing experience to have new and greater things on the client version of, like, with actual routing. and you get all these good things on the server as well. If you want, you just add a plugin, you get TanStack Start, and you're ready to go. So, React Router 7 and TanStack Start are way more aligned than they are different. There's just, important but more subtle differences between something like us and Next.js. So yeah, that's the vision that I have for it, is that I definitely am going to keep focusing on the client side experience. For instance, routing. I know that a lot of people are going to be like, well, you have server-side capabilities now. What are you going to do? Are you going to go cloud, tools, utilities, server, utilities? No. Once we get Start out, I'm actually going back to TanStack Router. I have more features and more very powerful concepts that still need to happen in TanStack Router that I haven't seen in any other router. Things that I think are going to actually elevate the experience of building an application and with regards to routing.
Awesome. I'm looking forward to seeing those. Like you said, let's end on the React Server component side of things. You said it's not yet fully, Start is not yet fully compatible with React Server components, but I've heard you say that you have some really fun ideas how to incorporate them. So talk about that for a minute.
Yeah, so I've done a lot of playing around and research, proofs of concept with RSCs. In fact, I have local branches on my machine where RSCs are mostly working. I say mostly because there's still some things missing, and they are really fun. So let me tell you my philosophies on React Server components. I'm going to start by saying that I think they were named incorrectly. React Server components is a bad name. They should have been called pre-rendered components or serializable components. They don't sound as good, but whatever. The reason I say that is because server components, they don't just happen on the server. They just happen before the client is really what it is, or just in a different place than the client. And Dan Abramov gets into this a little bit, that there's two Reacts, right? There's the React that's running on the client, and then there's the React that's running everywhere else. It's not really, it's going to be a server a lot of the time, but it could be your local machine statically deploying something or statically pre-rendering something. Or you could even run RSCs in like a worker if you wanted, like in a web worker or something like that. But at the end of the day, really what it is you're just taking a bunch of React component code and you're rendering it to string. And you can't do that totally on the server without running into some problems around suspense and running into problems around client components that are using interactive hooks. So what happens is it's more like it's a partial application of the rendering process. It says, we're going to render as much as we can of this React component here. And for the things that we can't do, we're going to leave them alone. And we're going to ship the rest of the work down to the client or wherever it's going to get rendered. And you can finish the rest of the work there. And to do that, they have to take the rendered element and they have to serialize it into something that can be streamed somewhere else. And it has to support streaming because of suspense, which is really cool. So everybody's been looking at React Server components as if that's kind of the primitive, the server component. Everybody likes to say that. What is a server component is really, it is a stream of text. That's all it is. It is an iterable, like if we're talking TypeScript types, it is an iterable of string that you are shipping somewhere else that's going to be incrementally read back out. And you just need the tools on the other end to transform that stream of text back into React elements. Some of those are going to be HTML elements that are just really easy to convert back into React components. But some of those are going to reference client components where you're going to need to say, oh, this is a button. So we need to import the button code. And when it's ready, we'll render the button as we're kind of bringing it back out of this serialized state. That's all RSCs are. And so when I talk to people about React Server components or just server components in general as a concept, I like talking about iterable strings and then the utilities to serialize that and then bring it back to life on the client. That's all it really is. Where I have interesting ideas, I think, around this is that when you boil things down to just primitives, like an iterable string, I like that because now you can start thinking about it from a primitives first approach. Now, RSCs, React Server Components, are just another form of data that you're getting from the backend. It could be JSON, it could be whatever. Like I'm going to say it again. It's just server state. Like for those of you who have gotten into React Query or TanStack Query Mind, it's just server state. It really is, or just state that came from your server. And if we know anything about server state, it's that there's lots of challenges with managing server state. That's what React Query was built for. You run into challenges of staleness. You have to invalidate. You have to track dependencies. You have to be able to scope things down to invalidate only certain portions of it, right? And it gets a lot into caching. Like, I haven't heard of anybody talk about this yet. How can you cache a React Server component? I think a lot of people would be like, my first reaction was, you cannot cache an element. How do you cache a React element? You would have to serialize it into what? An iterable string, the string, right? So in a way, I'm looking to approach React Server Components from this perspective, where we already have great tools at TanStack to manage and wrangle and not just control server components, but like exploit their strengths tenfold. We already have the capability to cache them and to persist them to disk and bring them back to life. We have the ability to move them around, push them through a router, push them through query. We could stream them into a table. Like, we could do all of these things that we need to do because we've already built the utilities to do it. So, for instance, with TanStack Start, the way that you're going to use a server component is it's going to be a server function or an API route, really anywhere that there's a network IO boundary. And if you return JSX or an element, you have created a server component, and that's it. And on the client, you will receive a stream of text, an iterable of text, like of a string, and we will give you the utility that you need to convert that back into a React element to render. It's that simple. But before you do that, you could pipe it through the router. You could pipe it through query, a persister. You could pipe it anywhere that you want, and we'll have everything in place to be able to cache it and manage it and invalidate it. See, Next.js, they support RSCs, but everybody so far has just taken, the approach of, well, if you need to get new content from your server that's a React Server component, you have to invalidate everything, right? Well, we already have granular invalidation with React Query and dependency tracking and management. So if you put your RSCs through React Query, you get granular invalidation for free.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to seeing like different approach to server components that is not influenced by Next.js just taking them 3 years ago and almost making it their own concept. Thank you, Tanner. In this episode, we've been talking mostly about your road about your journey in open source over the past, 15 years or something like that.
Sure.
Thank you so much for all of your contributions. Yeah, I'm sure many of our listeners and viewers already know who you are from your work. Hopefully right now they can see you in person on the screen. Can you maybe last few words about how can people contribute, get in touch with you? What would you like them to see, to watch from your TanStack ecosystem?
Sure. If you have nice things to say, you can just get on Twitter or X or whatever. I'm on there. I'm also on other social networks, but not as much. But you can talk to me anywhere you want to talk to me. If you have not nice things to say, then you can jump on Discord. You can DM me in Discord anytime. We have a TanStack Discord. If you go to tanstack.com, there's a link in the sidebar for Discord. We've got a really healthy community there. I think 6,000 people at any given moment. There's 600 people on there ready to chat about TanStack stuff. And you can talk to us in there. If you want to contribute, that's the best place to start. There's plenty of people with questions about how to build things with TanStack Start and what to do and best practices. And that's where everybody who is a contributor now to TanStack Start or TanStack Query or whatever, that's where they started. TK Dodo started in Discord, answering questions. Same thing with everybody else. So yeah, if you want to contribute, then come hang out.
Thanks a lot again. Thanks for joining me on this show, and see you around on conferences and
Absolutely.
Online.
I can't wait.
Bye. React Universe Conf just dropped its first speakers, and I'm excited to share the initial lineup with you. Early bird tickets are live, so if you enjoy saving money, now's the time to grab yours.